welcome to the Rob Burgess Show. I'm, of course, your host, Rob Burgess. On this, our 138th episode, our returning guest is Sarah Kendzior. First heard Sarah Kendzior on episode 70, 80, 89, 99, 112, and 128. Sarah Kendzior is best known for her reporting on St. Louis, her coverage of the 2016 election, and her academic research on authoritarian states. She is currently an op-ed columnist for the Globe and Mail, and was named by Foreign Policy as one of the 100 people you should be following on Twitter to make sense of global events. Her reporting has been featured in many publications including Politico, Slate, The Atlantic, Fast Company, The Chicago Tribune, Teen Vogue, and The New York Times. Her book, The View from Flyover Country, Dispatches from the Forgotten America, was published April 17, 2018, and is now a New York Times-bestseller. You can listen to her podcast, which she co-hosts with Andrea Chalupa, Gaslit Nation. Also, a quick shout-out before we start the show to Mercer Suppiger, who created the brand new logo for the Rob Burgess Show. You can see more of his work at www.mtsuppigger.com. And now on to the show. Well, cool. Well, thank you so much for coming back.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. Not much has happened since we talked. No.
Oh, God. When did I last talk to you?
I think it was when the child separation policy was happening.
Oh, good God. So like a year ago almost.
3 years in my mind, at least.
Seriously.
But we have now 4 incomplete sentences from the Mueller report. And a partisan book report from Bill Barr. And I think I had probably more faith in Mueller than you did, although, once again, you've been proven correct in that, you had a podcast episode, as you pointed out, that was Mueller will not save you, so that came to fruition, basically. First of all, let's just start with the collusion. We know what's out in the open. We know what we see every day. How does that not count? Adam Schiff, I thought, brought this up rather well the other day in the House committee that he spoke in. What about Russia, if you're listening? Does that not count? Does Don Jr.'s meeting not count? What about everything else we know? How does that not all count just because it's happening in public?
Yeah, it's extremely frustrating because this has been playing out in public, not just during the administration, but during the campaign, and then for decades before the campaign, and all of these documented illicit relationships that he and members of his team have had with various oligarchs, mafiosos, and sometimes officials. I feel like the Barr memo, that 4-page memo with 64 actual words from the Mueller report, purposely labeled it Russian government to try to narrow the scope and to make all of these meetings, like, for example, the Trump Tower meeting with Don Jr., fall out of the category of conspiracy, because it's not like literally Putin in the room. But, we've gotten pretty close. Like when Trump went and asked Russia to get Hillary's emails at a press conference, when he committed obstruction of justice by firing Comey and partying with, Lavrov in the Oval Office the next day, and then bragged about it on TV with Lester Holt. Like, those are blatant crimes. And I always thought that Barr was hired specifically to, negate whatever potency the Mueller report had. He's like an Iran-Contra cleanup guy. He cleans up messes for Republicans. He was there to exonerate Trump regardless of what the evidence says, and that's what his role seems to be. My fear is that the Mueller report itself will be a similar form of gaslighting, and I'm hoping that that's not the case because, with all of this evidence in the public domain, the evidence that Adam Schiff and others have called out, the evidence we've seen with our eyes and heard for years, it would be very hard to do that. But I've been frustrated with the way that the Mueller report went, with his refusal to interview key parties, including Trump, but also Assange. I also believe, Bannon, Kushner, and with the lack of indictments for actively dangerous people, and the terrible plea deals that went absolutely nowhere with people like Flynn and Gates, who are dangerous individuals just walking around. Like, I can't judge the report because none of us have seen it. I don't know what's in it, but I can judge the probe. And it's like, the probe sucks. I mean, I give it like a C-, BP, like some effort for trying. I don't know if it sucks because Mueller wasn't good at his job or his team wasn't, or because he was obstructed at many levels by this administration, who, of course, if he was sincere, did not want him nosing around in all their crime. It's not like it was going to be easy. But nonetheless, all I could judge is the efficacy, and it hasn't been effective at curtailing corruption and criminality at the highest levels of government, which is what I'm concerned about. So overall, disappointing, I guess. I didn't have high expectations yet. I am still disappointed, but I'm very wary about the future. I think things are about to get much worse.
Yeah, I remember the first time we ever talked, I was very worried because I was like, is he going to fire Mueller? Is that what's going to happen? But then I never considered, I always thought Mueller, if it came down to it, right? If it came down to him being fired or he taken it to the Supreme Court, with the interviewing the president or not, I always thought he would stand his ground, just do the thing, and he would offer to be fired but he didn't. How is Jared and Don Jr. and Ivanka still walking around? Why aren't they in handcuffs right now? Why aren't they perp walked? We already know they've committed crimes openly, blatantly. And I will give some credit because there are some state charges still in the offing, I guess. And Trump can't pardon those. But why didn't he try to interview Trump on the record? Why not? He can say no, and he can take it to the Supreme Court, and Justice Bart Kavanaugh will be the fifth vote, and you'll make it okay. But at least make him go through the motions, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's about accountability. It's about enforcing rule of law and saying to the American public that rule of law matters and that the president is not above the law, and that if you're the special counsel, you are not working for the president. You're working for the American people to ensure accountability in government. And I'm not sure that that is Mueller's primary concern. I think he's worried about the Republican Party. I think he's very worried about the FBI. I think he's an institutionalist. You have to consider Mueller was the head of the FBI from 2001 to 2013, meaning that he ran the FBI while a number of the people who he indicted for crimes committed those crimes. Manafort, for example, was indicted for crimes in the early 2000s while Mueller was running the FBI. That did not give me an enormous amount of encouragement, because it's well, why didn't you get this guy the first time around? You've got Paul Erickson of NRA and Maria Butina fame indicted for crimes he committed in 1996. All of these guys could have been and should have been taken down earlier and weren't. And so you have to wonder, how effective is Robert Mueller, as a prosecutor, as an investigator? Why was he so light on the Russian mafia? Why was he making seemingly deals that went nowhere, that were bad bargains? There's some other talk, Mueller, during the time after he left the FBI, but before he was the special counsel, was working for a private firm where he, that firm represented Jared, Ivanka, and Paul Manafort. And from what I've read, Mueller was not directly working on those cases, but the person who waived the potential conflict of interest there is that woman that used to work for Jeff Sessions that CNN just hired to be their propagandist. I was rereading the information about that, and I was like, oh my God, well, then her name pops up again. It all looks a bit suspicious. I don't want to think that Mueller was a long con and that the whole thing was fake, because obviously, there were a lot of people indicted, there were a lot of charges brought, actual things, were investigated and happened. But I don't know whether his loyalty to country supersedes his desire to not have the FBI in his own record kind of implicated, not in a criminal way, but just in a kind of a humiliation way. Good Lord, why didn't you do anything to stop these people from getting into power? And I think also, to some extent, he's a Republican loyalist. He's a friend of Barr. He's going to give all these guys the benefit of the doubt when they absolutely don't deserve it. And I wonder how much that weighed on the investigation itself, and his faith in American institutions, and that we're just going to kind of bounce back from this. Comey is the same way. He's out there saying, oh yeah, just give it a couple of years, we'll be fine. We are not going to be fine, and we were not fine before, and we're certainly not fine now. So it is very frustrating that this massive danger to national security is not resolved in any meaningful way. We are certainly no safer than we were before the probe began.
Yeah, and how is it that just every rock you kick over with these people, there's just a festering pile of corruption? Like, I think he had to have turned over something, and to say that there's no collusion and you can't make a final decision on obstruction, what was your job? Like, that's your whole job. I thought that was the thing you were going to tell us.
Yeah.
What?
No,
And you're,
it's
yeah.
it's so wussy. Like I'm just like, where is your courage? Like you have so much power here. Like you're literally at a position where you can determine to some degree the course of American history, and all of the evidence in the public domain is on your side. Like it's very hard to say that Trump did not commit obstruction. Like we saw it. He did it on TV with Lester Holt. You know, he
Yes,
gave us
exactly.
the easiest way. It's not like some sort of complicated financial dealing that you're going to have to explain to the American people. Like we can just watch the video. And he still won't do it. So I don't know if he's gutless. I don't know whether this was a little maneuver. You know, he's going to kick it down to Barr, who of course is going to obstruct it, or kick it to Congress, you know, which is not going to act on it with a Republican majority. Either way, I mean, I just keep thinking if I were him right now and I felt that my report were misrepresented grossly by Barr and by the mainstream media, who had this endless parade of headlines saying Mueller report says this, Mueller report says that, when there's no Mueller report to look at. If I were Mueller, I'd be really pissed. I'd be like, oh my God, I spent, you know, years on this investigation and you are butchering the results. You're misleading the American public on a serious issue and you're causing a crisis. And I'd come out and I'd hold a press conference and I would correct all those errors. I don't understand why he's not doing that unless he wants people to think that this might be true and he wants this narrative to set in. I do not understand the hesitancy. You know, this is not the time for silence. I sort of understood as he was doing the probe that he wanted to keep quiet to not, you know, mess up on the protocol of it and, you know, just basically give information away that would make it less effective as an investigation. But that time is done. You know, he needs to speak up. And I just keep thinking, like, you know, so many people put their lives on the line to confront this administration and its players every day. And you are, you know, just so pampered and in your little DC enclave, and you won't come forward for like when the American people need you to fulfill your basic professional obligation. Like, what is wrong with you? I don't get it. You know, not a fan. So.
Well, he's a private citizen again, right? He could just come out and say anything that's not classified, right?
Yes, exactly. And you would think that he would feel obligated to just because of the news cycle, because of the headlines. I just know as an individual, if I had a ton of headlines in major papers about a serious national security issue, like falsely representing what I've said. And I think that we can basically say that that's happening because even Barr's memo said Trump was not exonerated. And then you get these headlines and you get Trump saying, I'm exonerated. And then, you know, people just kind of blindly agree with it. You think he would want to make clear what he thinks happened, you know, what effect it has on our national security, how safe are we as citizens, what does this mean for our government? And it's as if he's just checked out and he doesn't care what happens next, or he thinks that it's like a foregone conclusion what happens next. I mean, my biggest fear is that this is a sort of, I mean, I hope that this isn't the case because this is like too dark, but it's Trump. So it's like, I can't rule anything out. That this is a kind of reality TV show layout where what they want is for everybody to say, okay, Barr put out a load of crap. What we need is the Mueller report. We need the sincere, in-depth, well-investigated Mueller report to tell us what went down. And I worry that the Mueller report will be a giant gaslighting piece of garbage. And then, but what will have happened, of course, is that all the Democrats will have said, yes, I place my full trust in Robert Mueller and his report, and then we'll be forced to reconcile themselves with this document. So I would encourage everyone to just hold off on having any opinion of the Mueller report until you see the Mueller report. That's the only time that you can have an opinion. And if it doesn't represent things that we've seen with our eyes and ears, if it leaves out events that we've personally witnessed, which we have because Trump is so loquacious on Twitter and on television, then I would question, you know, whether there were biases that went into the construction of that report. I don't know why and for what reason, but I think we can still just use common sense and identify them. Hope it doesn't come to that.
Wow. Yeah. Well, I sold all my It Can't Happen stock in 2016, so I'm out on that game. So
It's good
whatever.
news.
Anything could happen, I guess. But okay. So I heard your most recent Gaslit Nation episodes, and they've especially the one prior to this last one with the impeach normalization one. It was a very emotional episode, but it strangely made me feel like, yeah, I'm not crazy. People are as upset as I think they should be finally about this. At least some people are. I wish more people were, of course, but the comment that you guys homed in on for the Manafort judge about him leading an otherwise blameless life. What a statement that was. Wow. I mean, because if somebody that blatantly corrupt can't get at least a stern talking to when they get sentenced, like what's hope is there for me? you know?
Yeah, I mean that's one of the reasons that I'm worried about the Mueller report, and that I'm
Mhm.
worried that it may paint a erroneous portrayal of things that we see because of statements like what that judge said, which I think even the Republicans were kind of like, holy shit, like otherwise blameless life. It's one thing to give him a minimal sentence, and of course, as I mentioned on the show, that judge, while an asshole, was also threatened. He was threatened
Mhm.
over the summer. He had to have a private security detail. The jury in that case, which did deem Paul Manafort guilty, they were threatened as well. The other judge in the Manafort sentencing was threatened, Amy Berman Jackson. She was threatened by Roger Stone. That's what happens in a mafia state. And I think, this is what we're dealing with. And so these proclamations about Manafort and his otherwise blameless life, possibly could have been said out of some sort of sycophantic
Mhm.
idiocy toward the Republican Party, also could have been said out of fear of repercussions from Manafort's camp, because this is a guy who has been working for dictators, for the mafia, for oligarchs, for the most dangerous and brutal people around the world for several decades. You don't really want to get on his bad side. We shouldn't live in a system where, the judiciary is so terrified of the people that are on trial that it feels it needs to be their supplicants. But that's what we saw. But it was very upsetting. It was shocking. And, this is a person who, if you listen to the show, has personally threatened, Andrea's family, has made both of our lives less safe. Yeah. And then to have the double punch of those sentencings, and then Pelosi coming out immediately after and saying that impeachment is not worth it. When we
Yeah.
have, who is the person who's by far the worst president of the United States, and I think just one of the worst Americans of all time, who has violated blatantly so many laws, has committed so many impeachable offenses that if I named them all, like your show would be, 12 hours long. It's just a detestable person who's been accused of multiple crimes for his entire life. Like, if he's not worth it, then who is? And, the feeling of that sentence, really, of that statement was that we're not worth it. The country isn't worth it, that people aren't worth it, that it's not worth fighting dangerous criminals who are destroying our country. And that's a horrible message to send. It's both weak and it's insulting, and it denies people's pain and it denies the severity of the situation. And then, of course, there's been this farcical argument that the Democrats need to wait for the Mueller report before making any kind of decision regarding impeachment. Like, that's ridiculous, because so many crimes fall outside the purview of the Mueller report, emoluments or abuse of the pardon power, things like that. Like, that's not what Mueller was looking at. But also, like, the job of Congress, the reason they have the impeachment power is to impeach a criminal president, is to get rid of a president who becomes a tyrant. That's why that's, written into, our system by the founders. And for them to just disregard it and be like, oh yeah, we're just going to vote him out, which is its own set of problems given, how compromised the election system is. I mean, it blows my mind. It is the weakest thing. It's certainly not why people voted in a blue wave of Democrats. So yeah, very disappointing there.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the Nancy Pelosi statement, because that was just so upsetting, because, as you pointed out, he does 10 impeachable things a day. out in the open, and just he's just blatantly unfit for the job. That's one thing. Why can't we just impeach him for that? But anyway, they're acting like they get one shot at this, which is really upsetting. And you
I'm
don't
so
get one
sick
shot.
of that phrase. I'm glad you bring up that phrase because that's something that's just bleeded out in my Twitter mentions for the longest time. Was Mueller only gets one shot, Pelosi only gets one shot. It's like, that's crap. He committed like a shitload of crimes. Like, we've got many, many shots. If one of them doesn't work out, then keep firing. I mean, it's absolutely ridiculous, and I don't know why they have that position. And it's also with impeachment. I don't think that it'll actually succeed in removing Trump. You can be impeached and stay in office. You have to, decide whether it's right to go. In the case of Nixon, who had committed, felonies, he decided to resign before, he could be impeached because I think he saw what was coming down the road for him. With Clinton, in a case that, while what Clinton did was disgusting, it was, a Republican witch hunt. It was an attempt to get Clinton removed from office. That was the goal. And then they were looking for a crime. It wasn't that they found a crime and then needed to remove him. That was different, and he stayed. Trump has committed, countless crimes. He will never go. I mean, I think even if he's voted out, we're going to have trouble getting him to leave. He's going to say that it's rigged, and he's just going to sit there. So the point of impeachment is not necessarily to remove him. I mean, ideally it is. The point is to get information out to the public. And we've had hearings that have been very effective in doing that. The Comey hearings early on were effective. The Cohen hearing more recently was effective. And the Democrats don't seem to really want to do that either. And when they have a hearing, like they did, the one where Schiff spoke recently about Russia, they're very ineffective at promoting it to the public. Like, I don't get why they're not OJ trialing the shit out of this. I work enough in media to kind of know how to hype something up, how to give it attention. I don't know why they're not trying to better convey what's happening to the American public. And granted, it should be bipartisan. The Republicans should be as concerned about this as the Democrats. They're obviously not. Their concern is, being implicated in the crimes. So of course they're not going to tell everyone when Adam Schiff is live on C-SPAN. But it's a weird dereliction of duty, and it's a culture of fear. It's the same vibe I got during the Manafort sentencing, where you just sort of sense that everyone is very afraid and that the full story is not being told. And that's a frightening thing to deal with just as a citizen.
Mm-hmm. What do you think of the argument, though, on the other side of it, that if you do what you say and impeach him and it doesn't work, you give them more power because they look stronger? Do you think there's
that argument cracks me up, because that argument assumes that we are living in a shared reality in which we are basing our emotions on things that actually happen. Whereas for the Republicans and for sort of the Fox News brigade, and certainly for Trump, the reality is created by Trump. I mean, he's tweeting out that he's been exonerated by Mueller. Like, that actually did not happen. And so all the jubilation, all the celebration is based on something that he has just made up. If Barr's report had condemned Trump and said he was a criminal, he would have reacted in the same way, with, vengeance, a desire for vengeance, and with a kind of, triumphalism, like, I've proven somehow this report is fake. Like, it doesn't matter in some sense what actually happens in terms of how Trump is going to spin it and how he's going to promote it. Like, he's never going to be shamed. He's never going to be silenced. He's never going to admit defeat. He's just going to make shit up until, he convinces people that he's won something. So the people that need to hear this, though, are the American public, because they're owed an explanation. And so I don't think that Trump can get stronger just because he proclaims that he's stronger or he won. And we're actually seeing this in the polls that have come out after the Barr memo, in which all these Americans were bombarded, with Trump's tweets proclaiming a win, with all these headlines saying that Trump had won. They don't believe he's won. They want to see the actual report, and his approval went down, and the approval of the Barr memo is extremely low. Like, people are not as dumb as they're being portrayed, and I think that everyone could really use and would appreciate a full airing of all of the evidence and concerns. And so, I think having impeachment hearings is a win-win for democracy. In terms of what it does to Trump on a practical level, that's much less clear. But in terms of what it does for our democracy, for establishing rule of law, for bringing, issues that have been shrouded in secrecy and criminality to light, that's a very positive thing, no matter how Trump reacts to it.
Yeah, and kind of one of my thinking is based on this Barr memo. I think that there's probably a lot of really, I mean, there's got to be, right? There's got to be some really terrible things that aren't necessarily crimes that I don't think Trump would want people knowing about. So that's kind of my hope too, is just that there's just enough sliminess in there that Republicans find themselves defending, and they might have a moment of self-reflection. They haven't had one yet. What do I know?
I think they're afraid. I mean, they are, by definition, implicated in all of Trump's crimes at this point, because they've been backing him for 2 years. Like, the longer this goes on, the harder it is for them to extract themselves, which is, I think, why we had so many Republicans quitting early, because they knew, the way that this was going. There's so much dark money alone in the Republican Party, through groups like the NRA, which we now know were the recipients of Russian money, and were, colluding with the Russians, that you could just be implicated by association, even if you weren't overtly involved in the crime. And so I think a lot of them are afraid of that. I don't know whether they'll ever have a moment of self-reflection. I mean, I think if they do, they would want to keep it private because of this culture of fear.
Right.
I mean, I suspect that some of them have privately thought, like, holy hell, when is this going to end? Get me out of this situation. As for whether there are damning things in the Mueller report, I mean, I would hope so. And I do kind of wonder whether, kind of similar to his indictments, there's a lot of damning information that skirts around the worst parties, basically Jared, Trump, obviously, Ivanka, probably skirts around Bannon, certainly around, Republicans in the administration, like Jeff Sessions, who, has committed crimes. He lied on his clearance forms and should have been interviewed. But probably makes them look pretty bad. And I think what does scare Trump, probably more than impeachment, is having a narrative that he can't control, is having a secret document, and he doesn't know what's in it, and he doesn't know what contents are going to be unleashed upon the world. And I can't tell really by his behavior at the moment whether he is afraid of that, or whether Mueller has informed him, or Barr has informed him of what is in the document. I mean, we should remember Barr's son is now advising Trump on legal issues, which makes it really hard for me to believe that Trump doesn't know everything about what Barr and Mueller are doing. But it's hard to say. I know he's uncomfortable with that, because then his little spin team has to leap into action and come up with some sort of counter narrative. And they're very, they're good at that. Once they know they're supposed to do it, they whip up all kinds of bullshit and they're pros at it. But whether they've done that yet, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, going back to the states, though, it is amazing that when these people come under even the slightest bit of scrutiny, it's just a total scam, fraud, every kind of criminality you can imagine. But it's like, I like people like Preet Bharara. I do. I really like him a lot. I think he's got good opinions on a lot of things. I would ask, I know other people have asked him before. It's like, come on, this was happening right in front of you, and you didn't prosecute him then?
Yeah.
Like, what was going on? Like, why not?
I mean, I've wondered, and I feel the fact that he was fired early makes me think he was trying probably to prosecute people, because all the people that were fired early were people who were involved in that process, researchers as well, who were looking at the Russian mafia. But yeah, I mean, this went on for such a long time. That's why I don't have faith in the state court system or city court systems, because they've turned a blind eye to these crimes for several decades, and not just with Trump, but with Manafort, with Stone, with a variety of players associated with the Russian mafia, with white collar criminals, with Wall Street criminals. I mean, it's just been the same thing over and over again, and it has broken it's not like I had great faith in the system to begin with, but it's even worse than I knew, because one thing that I can't figure out is, since all of these people were under FBI investigation or adjacent to someone who was, like Manafort was under FBI investigation in 2014, Trump's business partner / FBI informant / Russian mobster Felix Sater was often under FBI investigation investigation. I think it's probably likely that Trump was under FBI investigation, according to the Steele memo. He had been since at least 2011. Now, it's one thing to not prosecute them. That's bad enough. But when they start making a serious run for president and they win the nomination, and now they're getting national security information, and that they're hooked up with a transnational mafia syndicate, like, you're just going to let that happen. You're not going to try to put a stop to it or speak out. And, of course, with Comey, he did the opposite. He did everything he could to help Trump. He went after Hillary Clinton. He lied about, and the New York Times lied about the FBI investigating all of this. And that was one of the great frustrations of 2016, is that all happened out in the open as well. Like with Paul Manafort, you didn't need to look far and wide to find out about his crimes. You could go on Wikipedia, they were listed. You could say to yourself, this is not a guy we want running a major presidential campaign and having access to top secret classified information. We obviously don't want Trump doing that as well. And yet, it's like they just let the country go. They just put us all in tremendous risk. And even if we get rid of Trump, that risk is going to last. Mueller continued it by giving plea deals to people like Flynn, who were trying to sell illicit nuclear material. Now, of course, that's happening in the open with Saudi Arabia. It's deeply troubling. It gives the impression that there's basically a cabal, a transnational crime syndicate with complicit players from America who are not just the, goons of Trump's team, people like Michael Cohen, but people within the intelligence agencies, people within the FBI who perhaps do not have great loyalty to country. They might have loyalty to party, but that's a different kind of thing. It's troubling to look at those connections. It's troubling to look at what former heads of the FBI did after leaving the FBI. For example, William Sessions, who's FBI head briefly during the Clinton era before he was fired, went on to work for the head of the Russian mafia. All of that is deeply troubling. These interconnected ties, this financial and criminal and state nexus of corruption. I don't think we've ever had anything like it. And when people in positions of prosecutorial power appear to be implicated in it, even if tangentially, that makes it much more difficult to stop. And so I don't even know who we should be looking to at this point to actually stop this, because we need law enforcement to do it, and they've obviously been unwilling to for years, if not decades, and we don't know why. And that's what I would like to come out if we have impeachment hearings or hearings on the Mueller probe, is why why didn't you act? And I don't know whether they'll ever tell us, whether out of pride or because the answer is too horrifying or what, but I do think we have the right to know.
Yeah, definitely. And going back to William Barr, I mean, you mentioned this in your podcast, but he was paid to clean this up, right? I mean, that's why the whole reason he has the job right now. And, he's done this before. He cleaned up Iran-Contra. Shout out to previous Rob Burgess Show guests, Freeway Ricky Ross, and director of Freeway Cracking the System, Mark Levin. But he cleaned that up just fine, too. And that's the whole reason he has the job. I mean, he looks more respectable, I guess, than Matthew Whitaker, but I guess, but
God,
you know what I mean? That's right. Yeah, that guy. Anyway, but yeah, he was brought in to do this. That's the whole reason he has the job, and I have no doubt about that.
Oh, yeah. And he wrote those memos, on top of Iran-Contra. More recently, he wrote memos condemning the Mueller probe, saying that instead we should be investigating Hillary Clinton and Uranium One, which, of course, is now what the Republicans are proposing we do. They want to close out this chapter of investigating Trump and then move on to investigating the Democrats, for fascist crimes. I mean, honestly, I would like a actual investigation into why the Obama administration dropped the ball on a lot of these things. For example, since we've talked, there is that BuzzFeed expose about how the Treasury was infiltrated by Russia in 2015. I would like to know why nothing was done about that. I don't think we'll ever get a normal, nonpartisan, non-witch hunt-like investigation, but I do think it's a valid topic. All they want to do is turn do a 180 at this point, put the investigators in jail. This is such a classic authoritarian tactic. This is what you see in every democracy that transitions into an autocracy is, a failed investigation results with everyone who had inquiries and knowledge, whether they're journalists or officials, being locked up. So, obviously that worries me a lot. And, the talk of that has kind of started to go down after the initial rush, in part because I'm hoping that behind the scenes people are planning to put the actual unredacted, unedited Mueller report out. But it's very troubling because they just, it's purely about power and force. There's no regard for actual rule of law. Barr does not have it. These pundits and writers who think he respects it are out of their minds. There's nothing to indicate that he does and that he's anything other than a cleanup lackey who will lie and who will obfuscate for his own purposes and for Trump. It's pathetic. The same thing is true of Kavanaugh. We do not have, legal officials that respect constitutional law. And I don't know where we go as a country when that's the case.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Oh, that's just so galling. And I can't believe what Mitch McConnell has done to this country.
Yeah.
It's just the worst. It's like when that happened with Merrick Garland, that was I think we broke something that really we can't get back from until we address that.
Yes. And that's still a mystery to me. And not to sound too conspiratorial, but when I look at all of the things that were happening around that time, in terms of Russian infiltration into various bodies of government, for example, the Treasury, I try to think of what leverage could an outside party have had over our country or over the Obama administration specifically to make them so weak-willed and so unwilling to really put up a fight. They acted as if they were extremely confident that Hillary Clinton was going to be elected, and therefore they didn't need to worry about this issue and everything was going to be okay, which is, just so remiss and irresponsible. But also, in the background, there were all these serious security breaches. We had the State Department hacked, the DOD hacked, and later we had the DNC and the RNC hacked. We had just everything, a big national security compromise. You think that they would want to be extremely careful that an already fragile system of government does not get further hijacked by things like abusing, how Supreme Court seats are filled. But instead, there is just so much timidity and passivity and kind of, oh, don't worry about it, guys. It's all going to be all right. It's no, it is not. And, we will bear the consequences. We, the people, we, the ordinary people, are going to hurt the most from this dereliction of duty. And we are. It really puzzles me that they behaved in that manner. It's very interesting to go back and look at articles from that time where honestly, we were all somewhat more chill about the situation. I don't think any of us were thinking, obviously, Donald Trump is an agent of the Kremlin and will win the election in 2 years. That was the forefront of anyone's minds, even mine. But, nonetheless, we have institutions that they need to be protected, and they're not just going to magically protect themselves. And I think that is the mistake on a fundamental level that many people made.
Mm-hmm. And I think, a lot of people had, blind faith that, well, at least this part will still work. But it's just because it's kind of always been that way, but it's not forever, and it's no guarantee. I mean, there's no there's no money back guarantee on this. It either is or it isn't, and it is not because people stop doing it. I mean, look what happened to Turkey. Look what happened to Hungary. Look at what happened to, go down the line.
Oh, yeah. And once you lose the judiciary, that's the most important thing. That was my biggest fear once he won. That was the thing that I was most looking at. And when people like Preet Bharara or Sally Yates began to be fired, I was like, oh, God, they are doing this, classic maneuver. And then, of course, at the Supreme Court, that really capped it. I don't know how we get the country back from here, although I'm interested in these proposals that, are about expanding the Supreme Court to try to overcome this corruption. But yeah, you can turn, to an autocracy and not easily return to a democracy. We will be dealing with the national security consequences for a long time. And also with the fact that we have a lot of traitors. We have people who are out selling state secrets. We have countries that have had access, I would assume, to, the innermost sanctums of power, since Trump freely sells it to people for a long time. And I don't just mean Russia, I mean Saudi Arabia, Israel, China, Turkey, whoever wanted, something and was willing to pay up. I think Trump gave them an in. I don't know how that's going to affect us as a allegedly sovereign nation in the years to come. Like it's going to be pretty horrific, I think, to see how this plays out. And we're not unique. I mean, I think the UK and a lot of other Western nations are suffering through the same thing, but it's a new world order and not a good one.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Well, that does make me nervous for the future because, I mean, let's face it. I mean, Trump is a genius in some ways, and he's not very smart in other ways. He's just plain not very intelligent. And there's certain things that he does that he could be more effective, right? If he just didn't shoot himself in the foot all the time. But I feel like the danger is somebody else that isn't as, I don't know, lacking in certain ways will see what he's done, what he's broken, the ways to get in, and they'll go the same route, and they just won't be as blatant about it.
Oh, yeah. And I think we already have that in people like Mitch McConnell. We have these, and Pence, these sort of traditional Republican, underhanded, snakes who people don't kind of see as prototypical autocrats. They're not acting like demagogues. They're not having mass, hate rallies in the way that Trump is. But in their disregard for rule of law, in their abuse of power, they're acting in that tradition, and they're able to navigate the bureaucracy very effectively. And I do think it's possible that we'll have a slicker successor. My fear has always been, because I think this is clearly Trump's goal, is to put a dynastic kleptocracy, to install, probably Ivanka, but also possibly Jared in a position of power. And I think we have foreign countries that are very interested in having, one of those two be in a position of power. And we certainly have a Republican Party that does not want free and fair elections. They're actively trying to suppress the vote. They're welcoming election interference and, cyber interference. And I don't know whether we're going to have a free and fair presidential election again in my lifetime. I don't see the urgency that should be given to this issue being given to it by the Democrats. I think they're so afraid, as they were in 2016, and this completely backfired on them, to tell people about the threats to the integrity of our system. They think it's going to make people not come out and vote. Whereas honestly, one of the few things that can offset a threat that enormous is mass turnout, is like a real powerful show that, we are voting for this party and, the outcome can perhaps be questioned in a more credible way if we can show strength in numbers. They're just not, they're not taking this as seriously as they need to. And I know it's early in the campaign process, but we've had so many talks about, candidate scandals at this point, and very little talk about serious structural issues that are going to affect every voter. And I wish that there was more of that. The only person I see really, pounding in on that issue is Stacey Abrams, who of course, as yet is not running, but at least she's combating it because she, of course, experienced it firsthand in Georgia.
Right. I mean, she ran against the Secretary of State. How is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, that happens, like in Missouri, we had.
Yeah, but didn't he launch an investigation against her?
He did. Well, he launched a group. Jason Kander launched a group called Let America Vote immediately after the election. And, I mean, I've sort of hinted at this in previous interviews he did. Honestly, I don't trust the result of the 2016 Missouri Senate election. Like when I looked at the margins at where he lost, like which counties, like I know the state well enough. It didn't seem accurate to me. It didn't reflect what I saw on the ground covering the campaign. It seemed off. The same seemed true of the governor's race. I actually do think Trump won Missouri. Like I wouldn't contest that. But candor, I think possibly one as well. And because Missouri is the dark money capital of the U.S. and is also this sort of like petri dish for Republican experience and experiments and anti-democracy, I could easily see them doing things with our polling machines, our election machines. There was a lot of complaints about things not working. I could see something, for example, like we know that Russia is interested in our polling data. I think an easy way of suppressing the vote is simply dropping people from the polls, having them show up and be like, oh, sorry, you're not on here. You've got to go, in counties that they, in areas that they need to target. I think that possibly might have happened. And there's never been any investigations. Of course, everything I'm saying is speculation, but it would be weird to me if Russia went to these great lengths to obtain all this data, to examine our election machines, to volunteer to be election monitors, which they were doing unilaterally, not through the OSCE or something, and then didn't mess with the vote. Like, I'm trying to figure out the scenario where they're like, nah, let's not do it, guys. Like, that's illegal. I mean, I don't see that happening with either Russia or the GOP. But there was no investigation, so who knows? But it's very troubling. And again, I think that's one of those roads that the Democrats don't want to go down. They don't want to sound like sore losers. They don't want to sound like they're just bitching and whining and that they're doubting the integrity of the system. I do think we need to question the integrity of the system when the system's obviously been breached numerous times and there's been no accountability. I think that's pretty reasonable.
Well, I mean, you think about how the Republicans would act if it was them, and they were ready to impeach Hillary Clinton before she even took office. I remember there was talk of that. Just amazing. And Democrats get in power and they're, I guess, afraid to lose it, but you use it or lose it, I mean, and what do that is the one thing, I'm not going to say I respect it, but I do wish Democrats would take a lesson every once in a while from Republicans, and just like we always say, like, oh, well, if this was Obama, if this was Clinton, what would you say? We never take that next step and be like, well, maybe we should do that too. Like, if they're going to do this, let's, why don't we try that one time? They have everything.
I mean,
how do you think they got everything?
In terms of legal activities, they've had good strategies, like the, grassroots Tea Party-esque focusing on local elections, getting very involved on a sort of, micro level. That was smart. Creating a giant propaganda network, also smart. I mean, I'd rather it not be a propaganda network. I'd rather it just convey accurate information. But, and also just sort of, owning your opinions, owning who you are, like not trying to just be nice and sweet and please everyone. But I mean, the reason that Adam Schiff went viral for that speech, and the reason that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, so frequently goes viral for the things she says, are not because they're controversial statements, but because they're true. And because we're so unused to hearing someone speak honestly and passionately and in an informed way that the sheer novelty of it, makes it take off. And I think, that is what people need to embrace, in the Democratic Party. They need to stop trying to be like, oh, we're the calm and reasonable ones. It's like, no one should be feeling calm right now. There's nothing to be calm about. Like when there are children, snatched from their parents and put in cages and sexually assaulted, when we have a Russian asset in the White House backed by a crime syndicate, when we have, elected officials and judges behaving as though they're above the law and no means of accountability, and then, climate change and all these other issues that we have to contend with, there's no reason to be calm. And I think the average American is not feeling particularly calm right now. They're watching this sociopathic nuke fetishist, hold the reins of the White House, and they're reasonably freaked out. And I think, officials should feel free to be forthright about that. Another one who I think is effective that it always has been is Maxine Waters. She held her ground. She came out swinging from the start. She said, we need to impeach him. He's a criminal. He's a liar. He's a racist. She didn't mince words. And people are hungry for that because it's true, not because it's like a rhetorical strategy or, something that they poll tested, but just because it's true. Like, I don't know why that has to be, so complicated.
Yeah, Maxine Waters was on top of the Iron Contra thing from the beginning too. So
yeah,
she's been in the game. But AOC, yeah, I'm glad you mentioned her. I love everything that she's doing, but it makes me love it even more that Republicans get so mad about her just for existing, just for doing her thing. It's amazing. Like, and it's yeah.
No, she's great, and I like her a lot. And it's crazy to me how people see her as this, radical. Like, just because historically speaking, the policies that she's advocating are, they would have been moderate, like during the time of the New Deal or during like Harry Truman's proposed Fair Deal, or even like under Eisenhower. Some of the things that she's putting forward would be moderate proposals, but we've gone so far to the right. But I think people respond to just the pragmatism of her. I mean, she's held up as this kind of radical idealist, but many of the issues she's speaking about, particularly environmental issues, she's far more sensible and pragmatic than the so-called moderate or conservative wing of the Democratic Party. Because the reality is, if we don't act on climate change now, we are heading for a humanitarian catastrophe, an economic catastrophe, and their unwillingness to do anything about it. That's the idealism. That's the senselessness. Not what Ocasio-Cortez is talking about. So yeah, I hope people take her seriously. I feel like she's sometimes unfairly dismissed because of her age, her gender, and because she has become this target for the right. So she has to spend so much of her time like swatting off these attacks. And she's very good at that, but she's better at, outlining policy. So I hope that they give her just as much time to do that as to, bat away annoying, Fox News anchors and whatnot.
Well, I mean, she had one of my favorite moments of that Michael Cohen hearing when she basically laid the groundwork to get Trump's taxes. I mean, obviously they already had that power, but now it's like she just asked some very simple factual questions, and she got right to it. And that was okay. All right, I guess we need to see the taxes then. So.
Yes, yeah, exactly. And so she laid that groundwork, and again, I'm kind of like, okay, so where are the taxes? Right. Like I'm working on a book now, and like one of the things that I was writing about earlier this week was the fact that the Czech Stasi, like back when it was the Czech Socialist Republic, in the 1970s, there were these files that were found in 2016 saying that Trump had struck up some secret deal with a branch of the American government, unnamed in these documents, to not pay taxes for the next 30 years. So I guess, from 77 to 2007. And like, that sounds insane. But the document also laid out all these other things which came true, that Trump was contractually obligated to have 3 children with Ivanka, with Ivana, excuse me. And Trump was to run for president in 1988, which he nearly did. And then again in 1996, which he nearly did. They're very strange documents. They came from the monitoring of Ivana Trump, of course, was from the Czech Republic. Her father was there. He was working as an informant. I am wondering about these taxes because it is bizarre to me that we are this far in. We are now on like year 4 of asking for Trump's taxes, and that this isn't considered, a crisis given his incredible history of corruption, bankruptcies, mafia ties. I wonder if some kind of deal was struck. I'm trying to think of an explanation why it would go on this long. People like to give these sort of, more mild ones, like, oh, he's just not as rich as he seems. I'm like, oh, come on. Like, if that were the case, he would just be saying that, he's the everyday man, and he'd be using it for sympathy. Like, it's very hard to find something that Trump can't spin. And I would think like making some sort of bizarre and illicit deal with the U.S. government to not pay taxes, that's pretty hard to spin. That's like one of the few things I can think of that just sort of blows my mind. And I'm like, is that even possible? And if it is, like, how the hell does that happen? And maybe they don't want to tell. I don't know. But yeah, I wish they would. I wish they'd heed her words.
Mm-hmm. Well, and there's no innocent explanation for not doing it either. So I mean, they don't even have a cover story.
Like Bernie hasn't released his either, and I'm kind of like, this needs to just be like a requirement of any presidential candidate. Like, I think we'll weed out, any potential Trumps, and assuming we have a future in the future, just with this simple requirement, it will, knock people out of the field. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, do you have any favorites at this early date for the Democrats? Who do you think is good?
I mean, not exactly. Like, I like Warren. I like that she's talking in a forthright way about corruption. I feel like she's basically they're all afraid to talk about what's happened, which is basically that a crime syndicate, an international crime syndicate, has hijacked the government and the presidency. I think they're afraid to say that in stark terms because it's so frightening. When she talks about, kleptocracy, when she talks about white collar crime and criminal impunity, I feel like she's kind of getting at that issue without addressing it in a forthright way. And whoever I vote for, I want, them to be somebody who will address that head on and, root out the corruption and be very firm about it. So I lean towards her. I like Pete Buttigieg, in general. In the beginning, I was like, the only person I knew who knew who he was and liked him. I liked his early interviews. There are things he said about kind of abandonment in the Midwest in his own, videos that I related to. Lately, there have been not so much interviews he's done, but excerpts from his book that I read that I'm kind of like, I want to know what you mean by that. Like, that's a strange way of phrasing things. Like, for example, when he talked about, protests held to raise the salaries of janitorial workers at Harvard in a kind of derisive way. Like, I want to know, just did you intend to make it sound that way, or is that just a terribly written paragraph, or what? And the rest of them, I mostly am just stuck on, we need to work on voter suppression. We need to make sure our elections, are held with integrity, are free and fair. Before we get into the candidates, I do think the broadness of the field is actually good because it prevents a smear from sticking to anybody from too long, especially for the female candidates. Like, if all that misogyny were leveled at one woman, we know what it would look like. It would look like 2016. So if there's going to be an incredibly sexist election, which there is, unfortunately, this time around as well, it's, I guess, at least evenly distributed. It's sad that this is like my improvement is that. It would be ideal if I just didn't have to think about this at all, but I guess I'd rather have it around. There are only a few that I really don't want, like Howard Schultz, no. Tulsi Gabbard, no. I'm really not a fan of Biden or Bernie. I feel like they've both kind of had their time. If they were the Democratic nominee, obviously I would vote for them, and I would campaign for them, and I would do anything I could to get Trump out. But there are better contenders, I think, and I just want to see how they respond to ongoing crises. A lot is going to change between now and November 2020, and I don't think it's going to change for the better. So I want to see how they react to what's to come.
Mm-hmm. Well, the really important question I have to ask you is, how do you feel about Axl Rose being the lead singer of AC/DC now that Brian Johnson, maybe he's getting his hearing back, he might be the lead singer of AC/DC again? I don't know.
Wait, is that that's a temporary thing though, right? Because
I heard it being
for them before, and they've always done AC/DC covers. Like, they always do a whole lot of Rosie at every concert. Yeah. But what I had read that was exciting was that they're putting out a new album, and I know better than to get too excited about a new GNR album, because at one point I had spent half of my life waiting for one. It had literally been half my life. By the time that Chinese Democracy came out, it's like people were like, "Oh my God, the Mueller report, it's so slow." I'm like, "Please, bitch! I'm a GNR fan. I can wait forever." But if he's doing AC/DC, I don't know. I feel like, I could deal with that. I just want to make sure that this GNR reunited doing live concerts continues, because if they come back again, I'm totally going to go again. I still can't believe it happened. I still think about that day whenever I'm like, am I hallucinating everything, the Trump presidency, this Russia stuff? It's obviously so deranged that I've made it up, I'm in a coma or something. And reunited GNR completely fits into that. What would I dream about in a coma? Of course I dreamed that I went and saw reunited GNR. So I start to question my own sanity. And sure, Axl singing for AC/DC, that fits right into something else I would hallucinate. So it's all good. I'm obviously in some kind of drug-induced person.
Well, I actually think he makes sense for AC/DC as a singer. I've heard some. It translates well. I don't have a problem with it.
The vocal range is dead on, and I think he sings with more heart in a way. So I approve it. I just I prefer Guns N' Roses lyrically. I want this to keep going. I'm still super excited about it.
But. Oh, absolutely. Cool. Well, hey, thank you for coming on again, and I hope we can do this again. And I hope the Skype has sounded okay. It sounded okay to me. So.
Yeah, it sounded good. I'm gonna have to, look into how to record this. I'm so technologically impaired. But yeah, it was good to try it out on the receiving end.
Cool. All right. Well, have a good rest of your night.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Hello and welcome to the Rob Burgess Show. I'm of course your host, Rob Burgess. On this, our 138th episode, our returning guest is Sarah Kendzior. You first heard Sarah Kendzior on episode 70, 80, 89, 99, 112, and 128. Sarah Kendzior is best known for her reporting on St. Louis, her coverage of the 2016 election, and her academic research on authoritarian states. She is currently an op-ed columnist for the Globe and Mail and was named by Foreign Policy as one of the 100 people you should be following on Twitter to make sense of global events. Her reporting has been featured in many publications including Politico, Slate, The Atlantic, Fast Company, The Chicago Tribune, Teen Vogue, and The New York Times. Her book, The View from Flyover Country, Dispatches from the Forgotten America, was published April 17, 2018, and is now a New York Times-bestseller. You can listen to her podcast, which she co-hosts with Andrea Chalupa, Gaslit Nation. Also, a quick shout-out before we start the show to Mercer Suppiger, who created the brand new logo for the Rob Burgess Show. You can see more of his work at www.mtsupppiger.com. And now on to the show.